Welcome back to the person here in Santana and to you connected back home to our new EURA seminar. Today we'll be discussing automation in judgments, the role of AI in deciding cases, and we have a very special guest for this purpose. We have Professor Alexander Stremitzer from Zurich, and who wrote a paper that he'll be presented to us today with his co-author that he's not here with us, but really dealing with the issue of whether we can adjudicate cases using automation, using robots, using AI. This is a very interesting topic, and I will not take any more of your time, and I will leave the word to Professor Stremitzer.
Okay, so thank you very much, Andrea, for the kind words of introduction. I'm excited to be here. Thank you, Francesca, for the invitation. I'm also looking forward to spending time with you today. So I'm going to be here the whole day, and I would like to also hear a little bit about the research that you are doing in your studies and in your dissertations. This is a topic that is very much on the minds of people these days. Having your day in robot court, that's the title, and it's joint work with Ben Chen, who was a visiting fellow at my group in Zurich before going to Singapore, and now he's at the University of Hong Kong, and Kevin Tobia, who was a postdoc in my group and who went on to be a professor at Georgetown Law School. So let me introduce the talk by having this quote from a university president who actually asks the Chief Justice, John Roberts, in 2017, can you foresee a day when smart machines driven with artificial intelligences will assist with courtroom fact-finding, or more controversially even, judicial decision-making? And what John Roberts answered is, it's a day that's here. So let's take stock of what's already done. First of all, machines largely function as decision aids. So you've probably heard about algorithms, the Compass algorithm, advising judges on whether to grant bail. So in the US, you grant bail if, depending on the flight risk and the reoffense risk, and the Compass algorithm that has been discussed extensively in recent years is a proprietary software that actually gives judges information about how they should think of the flight risk or the reoffense risk of a defendant. And so this is widely used in lots of US states. Then there's also algorithms that are advising judges on sentencing. This is situations where there is still a human in the loop, but there's also instances where algorithms are the primary decision maker. So for instance, when we are talking about welfare benefits, or if we are talking about air travel exclusion, so the no-flight list for terrorists, if you are kind of deemed a risk, then you are put on a list. This decision is not a decision that was made by a human. It's a decision that is made by an algorithm, and you can maybe appeal this decision, and maybe you have a chance at some point to find a human judge, but originally this very important decision is made by an algorithm. Then there's of course algorithmic dispute resolution. So for instance, in eBay, if there's a dispute, people file a complaint, and this complaint is adjudicated by an algorithm. Now, seems that people are quite happy with this because that's of course quite cheap. It's also quite quick. But that's a situation where we have an algorithm being the primary decision maker. Then I've read at least press reports, I've not kind of seen it firsthand, that Estonia has moved their small claims courts to fully AI-powered courts. And then finally, there is the system in China, which is called the same type case reference system, which is a system which I think is quite fascinating, because when a judge is making a decision, the system basically tells the judge there was a similarly situated case before. The decision that you should take based on this similar situated case would be A. If you want to do B, please justify. So in some way you can think of this as a way how, at least it seems the Chinese, they care about consistency of judicial interpretation. Of course we might be concerned about rubber stamping and things like that, but in principle you could imagine that you can improve the consistency of legal decision making by a system like that. And that of course has at its core something like an AI judge, because there's already the algorithm that suggests a decision, and you can still, as a human judge, decide to take it into account or not. But there is a fully operating AI judge that we could, in principle, also make the decision by itself. And then there are cyber courts in Hangzhou that are a little bit like the Estonian model, where the AI judge is making the decision. What we can certainly say is that technological advances make judging plausible. So it is more and more technologically feasible to do judging through algorithms. So what we want to ask in this project is not the doctrinal question. So the legal doctrinal concern would be, would a robot judge undermine the right to a fair trial? Would a robot judge violate EU regulation related to AI? Would a robot judge violate the fair trial standards of the European Convention on Human Rights? Now, these are very important concerns, but even if those concerns are met, we can also ask the legal ethical question, and that would be, assuming that doctrinal challenges can be met, are robot judges procedurally fair? And that of course is asking the question whether defendants would feel being fairly heard if decisions are deemed legitimate, if an AI judge is making such a decision. So should machines be judges? Now, what we study is we study lay people's attitudes towards this problem. And there's a long tradition in legal psychology to study procedural fairness in this way. So Tom Tyler in the 80s pioneered this way of studying procedural fairness. And why do we care about procedural fairness and lay people's attitudes? Well, first of all, there are accounts that people are more willing to obey the law if they consider the law to be fair. So that's a reason why we would want to study what lay people think is fair, because we care about compliance by lay people. Second, there are people who have claimed that there are certain distinct procedural harms if defendants in a procedure feel that they were not fairly heard, or if they don't consider the process as fair and legitimate. So you could think of this as being another reason why we care about lay people's attitudes. So the question that we are going to ask is, would people in the legal community consider a robot judge as procedurally fair or unfair? Now, we came into this project with a couple of hypotheses. So the question is, do ordinary citizens evaluate AI judges as more or less fair than human judges? and probably going into this project, we thought that they would consider them as less fair. Then the next question is, maybe it could be that the relative fairness, kind of the comparative levels of perceived fairness could be context dependent. So I, for sure, when I came into this project, I thought that if we have high stakes, people would probably be less willing to accept an AI judge than if we have low stakes. Or if the whole case turns on objective facts as opposed to states of mind like guilt, we would probably accept an AI judge more. So this is what I thought. Like, imagine that you have a criminal case on one hand, and you have, let's say, a traffic violation on the other hand. Traffic violation, very low stakes. The only question is, did you do it or didn't you do it? In the other case, you have very high stakes. It is about your guilty mind. Here, my sense would have been that we accept AI judges more in one situation than in the other. So the question is, or the hypothesis is, that AI judges might fare comparatively better if it is about objective facts and if it is about low stakes. Now, next question is, can an AI judge give an ordinary citizen a sense of being fairly heard? So lay people might consider a hearing in front of an AI judge as meaningless. At least that was my intuition, also coming into this project, that yes, maybe a hearing in front of a human judge is something that I would value, but maybe, talking to the machine is not doing a lot. And so I would have imagined that AI judges are comparatively better if there are no hearings. So imagine there are lots of procedures, again, going back to the traffic violation. When you get a speeding ticket, it's very rare that you would get a hearing in front of a judge. And so in a situation like that, maybe we care less about the human judge than about the AI judge. So that was another kind of set of hypotheses we had going into this project. And then another point is interpretability. What's interpretability? That's basically the idea that you are able to interpret the decision that was reached by the judge, that you know why the judge actually reached that decision. And at least there is this view out there that we care about interpretability more for machines than for human judges. This might be justified or not, because I think the ultimately opaque decision maker is actually the human. In many ways, you can probably make a machine more interpretable than a human decision, but we're so used to human decision making that people might just decide that they don't care so much about interpretability for a human than for a machine. And so the hypothesis would be that the AI judges fare comparatively better if the decision is interpretable. Because for human judges, we don't really care about this a lot. Okay, so what's our project? So we, to our knowledge, we provide the first evidence of ordinary people's evaluation of AI robot judges. We ran 2 experiments. One experiment, I will explain to you, was kind of in some way a pilot study, and then we have had another experiment that was then properly powered to derive our main results. And these 2 experiments had in total 6,000 US adults. And what we experimentally vary is whether we have a human or an AI judge, whether we have a bail, a sentencing, or a commercial arbitration scenario, whether or not there is a hearing, and whether the judge's decision is interpretable. So you see that this is actually 24 different scenarios. So it's a 2 by 3 by 2 by 2 design. So it's actually a relatively big study. And what you see is, so we of course we vary the decision maker, AI judge versus human judge. We also vary the scenario, bail, sentencing, commercial arbitration. Here the idea is that bail is, or sentencing, sentencing is very much subjective. It's about guilt, kind of state of mind, and it's very high stakes. Bail is somewhere in the middle, and commercial arbitration is relatively low stakes and often kind of objective facts. You'll see it when I give you a glimpse into the scenarios. Okay, so let me give you a preview of our results, and then I kind of lay out how I arrive at these results. But first of all, as we would expect, we find that there's a perceived human-AI fairness gap. So proceedings with human judges are seen as fairer. This may be not very surprising. But we also uncover a way to reduce the fairness gap, which we call algorithmic offsetting, or algorithm offsetting. And what we find, and that's also very much in line with previous results in the literature, is that interpretability and hearings increase fairness ratings. So far so good. So this is, I think, what we all would have expected, that human judges are considered as more fair than AI judges, and that we care about interpretability and hearings. And if we have an interpretable decision, if we have a hearing, we consider this as more fair. Now, what came as a surprise is that this is true both for human and for AI judges. So remember, the hypothesis that we had coming into this project was that that maybe interpretability is not so relevant if we are in front of a human judge. It might be that we only care about this in robot judges. And we also came into this project kind of thinking that we don't care about hearings in front of a machine, that we might find that meaningless. This is not what our lay people thought. They thought that hearings are important, and they are important both for human and for AI judges. And they also thought that interpretability was important, and they thought it was important both for the AI judges and, unexpectedly, also for human judges. So, increasing an AI judge's interpretability or adding a hearing opportunity can actually reduce the fairness gap. So the project really is, yes, there is a documenting, yes, there's a fairness gap, but now there are different ways how we can actually reduce this fairness gap. And that's, of course, relevant for people who are designing these robot judges. So we are basically identifying different ways how you can make the acceptance of robot judges higher, which is important, I think, if you think about deploying these algorithms and if you're thinking about designing them. What are the features that are important? And I'm not even talking about, I talked to Rakele before, who has this PhD project about maybe deceiving people. So we are not even trying to deceive people. We are not trying to optimize the way in which people actually perceive that something is fair. We're just kind of telling them hearing, no hearing, or interpretability, no interpretability. So we're not kind of using psychological tools to try to make somebody find a proceeding more fair. And then kind of the third point is that we also find that the human AI advantage is more related to hard as opposed to distinctively human soft factors. So that's a result that we get from a mediation analysis, so it's not a result that we get from the experimental analysis itself, but I think it's an interesting additional result. So I will try to convince you, or we have some suggestive evidence at least, that suggests that perceptions of accuracy, perceptions of the procedure being complete, taking into account all of the information, is more important to lay people than the idea of being, or the kind of the sense of being fairly heard. Or I should not say that. It's the human AI fairness gap is driven more by a perception that humans have that the human is more accurate, as opposed to that the human is better at providing a hearing opportunity. So that's an additional result that we have. So let's go into a description of the studies. So the first study is this 3 by 2 by 2 by 2 design. Let me introduce to you the scenario. So we used a vignette methodology. So that's a methodology where you are giving a description to your subjects of a particular situation, and you're looking at how they react. And in this case, we were interested in their fairness ratings. So this would have been the arbitration scenario. The dispute between the parties centered around whether there was a smudge mark on the camera and whether the photograph was discolored. And the stake was $2,500. Then we had the pre-trial bail scenario. And here, as I said, the case turns on flight risk and further offenses risk. And you see, this is a little bit less objective because it's quite easy maybe to find out whether there's a smudge on the lens, but it's not so clear to find out what the flight risk is. So this involves more subjective judgment. And then, of course, the stake is also higher. Here we are talking about being in jail or not being in jail between the time when you are arrested and the time of when the trial takes place. And then the third scenario was custodial sentencing. So here, of course, the sentencing factors include the nature of the crime, the character and history of the defendant, whether the defendant was under great personal stress. So you see, this is more like whether the person had a guilty mind. It's very subjective, and it is also very high stake. It was 10 years in prison, depending on which way you went. So you see, this is really built in order to have this whole spectrum from very objective low stake to very subjective high stake. And in all these scenarios, of course, the decision went against John, and we asked people, how do you evaluate the fairness of the decision? Now, I also said we are varying whether there's a human judge or an algorithmic judge. Now, in the bail human scenario, it said in the state where John was arrested and charged, bail decisions are made by a judge. These judges are very experienced and can predict flight and further offenses risk to a very high degree of accuracy. Among other things, the judge already has information about John's background, his previous convictions, and potential extenuating circumstances, if any. Now, how do we do this for the machine? We say, in the state where John was arrested and charged, bail decisions are made by an algorithm. This algorithm employs advanced statistical and machine learning techniques and can predict flight and further offenses risk to a very high degree of accuracy. Among other things, the algorithm already has information about John's background. So you see, basically just a judge and algorithm is exchanged, and then of course we explain that in one case the judge is very experienced, in the other case the algorithm employs these advanced statistical machine learning techniques. But otherwise the scenario is identical. Then how do we vary hearing, no hearing? So what would be a hearing in front of an AI judge? You see, there's an algorithm, and by speaking to a computer that transcribes the speech for consideration by the algorithm, through this hearing, the algorithm is able to evaluate John's credibility and emotions. So that's the way how we introduce the hearing opportunity for the AI, and then, of course, it could also be that there's a human and there's no hearing, and here you see we only switch algorithm to arbitrator, and the arbitrator would have been able to evaluate John's credibility and emotions. Now, how do we vary interpretability? So an interpretable decision is easy to understand. A non-interpretable decision is not easy to understand. And then we say, for the interpretable decision, it would be possible for someone else to replicate the decision maker's reasoning to see how a change in any of his factors impacts the sentencing decision. So this actually captures a very influential view of interpretability, which is that there is a transparency with regard to counterfactuals. So one way of thinking about interpretability is that a defendant or just a human being who observes this decision would be able to understand what would be the difference in the outcome of the decision if you change the input. And that, of course, is something that that we capture here. Yeah? And that's something that machines are actually quite good at doing. Yeah? You might vary the input and you see what effect it has on the output. So for the non-interpretable decision, we say it's not easy to understand, but given the complex nature of the decision-making process, it's not possible to describe in simple terms how the decision maker or how the decision was produced. Good, so let's go to the results. So first of all, what you see here is we find the human AI fairness gap. So the white-blue bar is the human decision maker, the red bar is the algorithmic decision maker, and you see that the human decision maker is always perceived fairer than the algorithmic decision maker. And that holds across all of the scenarios. Contrary to our expectations coming into this project, we don't find that there is an interaction effect between the human AI fairness gap and the scenario. And in the paper, actually, you'll see the regression table. So we don't find what we thought, that the human AI fairness gap is influenced by whether the question turns on objective versus subjective, or how big the stake is. So you see that there's no real, the gap is not influenced by, the absolute level is influenced by the scenario, but the gap is not influenced by the scenario. We also find that people care about hearings and they care about interpretability. So you see that the red bar on the left graph is higher than the white bar. So this is when we have a hearing. And you also see that the red bar, which is the interpretable scenario, is ranked higher in terms of perceived fairness than if it was not interpretable. But again, we don't find an interaction with the scenario. So it's not that we care about the hearing more in a high-stakes scenario where there is kind of a lot of subjective facts to be looked at, so that we don't care more about it relative to a human decision maker than in the low-stakes scenario. Good. So let's now look at study one at the regression table. So let me first show to you. We find that as we expected, that the algorithmic decision maker is perceived as less fair than the human decision maker. Second, we find that the hearing is increasing the perceived level of fairness. But we also find that the interpretability is considered to be increasing the procedural fairness, but in some way it's not really a finding here, because you see it's not significant. The coefficient goes into the right direction. You see the coefficient is positive. It means that introducing an algorithm makes interpretability more important, which means we care about interpretability more than sorry, this is not completely correct. So what I wanted to say is, so first of all, if you focus on the first algorithm here, we find that introducing the AI algorithm makes it less fair. Then we see introducing the hearing increases the procedural fairness. Introducing interpretability increases the procedural fairness, but that's not significant. And then, which I really would like you to focus on, is here the interactions. So this is getting at this question of whether we care about a hearing more if there is a human than if there's a machine. So if this is very negative, if this is a very negative coefficient and significant, it would actually lend support to our hypothesis that a hearing in front of a human is meaningless, in front of a machine is meaningless, whereas it is meaningful in front of a human. If we found that the second coefficient here, that you see at the 0.24, is positive and significant, that means that interpretability is important for a machine, but not for a human. So we see that both coefficients actually go into the direction that we had hypothesized, but they are not significant. So this, of course, begs the question of whether maybe the study was underpowered to detect these interaction effects. So everything, as I said, went into the direction as we had hypothesized, but it could be that we didn't have enough statistical power to detect the effects. So we actually did a simulation based on study 1, and that suggested that we needed a survey with 5,000 participants, and that would give us a 75 to 80% power to detect these interaction effects, which is generally considered to be good statistical power. So we did study 2. Now we only had a 2x2x2 design. So as we didn't find any effect of the different scenarios, we now only had one scenario, or we had all of the scenarios, but we collapsed them. And we vary these two things, decision maker interpretability and hearing. And again, we find that, first of all, we find there's a human-AI fairness gap. And then we find that the hearing matters and the interpretability matters. So that's highly statistically significant. This is just kind of replicating what we found before. And now look at the regression table for this second study. So you see that in both specifications, we have the algorithmic decision maker lowering the perceived level of fairness. Okay, so that is highly significant. Second, we find a hearing matters. A hearing makes things more procedurally fair. We also find that interpretability matters. It's highly significant. We didn't find that in the underpowered study. And now, interestingly, what you see is that that contrary to what we might have expected, where we say now we have a properly powered study, now we would expect that these coefficients become significant. That is not the case. So the coefficients become smaller. They are not significant, although we are properly powered, and they even go into the opposite direction for decision maker, for the decision maker interpretability interaction. So what that actually suggests is that this idea that a hearing would be meaningless in front of an AI judge is just not borne out by the data, and the fact that, or the hypothesis that interpretability is something that we mainly care of in front of an AI judge is also not something that's borne out by the data. Then we also do a mediation analysis, and we ask ourselves what drives this fairness gap. So remember, we found that there was this human-AI fairness gap. Now we can see which factors actually drove them, and we had an exposed questionnaire for our subjects where they could actually say how much they cared about the accuracy, or what they thought was whether the machine or the human were more accurate. And so we could actually look at their perceived fairness gap and their view of how accurate the procedure was, how thorough and comprehensive the procedure was. But we also had soft factors like understanding the defendant's position or the feeling that the defendant had a voice. And what you can see here is that the hard factors are factors that are not kind of specifically human, whereas the soft factors understanding of the defendant's position, feeling that the defendant had a voice. This is more kind of related maybe to human empathy. Now, what we found from this mediation analysis that 29% of this gap between the perceived fairness of the human and the machine is driven by people's views of accuracy. 27% is driven by the perception of accuracy, thoroughness and comprehensiveness. And only 12% is understanding the defendant's position, and only 2% is feeling the defendant had a voice. So what you see is that the human AI advantage, at least in our data, was not driven by distinctively human soft factors. So what are the implications? First, the human AI fairness gap is a challenge for robot judges. So this objection is now no longer grounded in just legal doctrinal terms. It's also grounded in perceived fairness. Beyond these doctrinal objections, there's this difference. But perceived fairness is influenced by hearing and interpretability, and adding a hearing and increasing interpretability matters both for human and AI judges alike. So surprisingly, adding a hearing does not provide a larger benefit in a human-led proceeding compared to an AI-led one. And surprisingly, improving interpretability does not matter more in an AI-led proceeding compared to a human-led one. So that means that lay people are amenable to algorithmic offsetting. So creating an AI judge that is more interpretable than a human judge narrows this fairness gap. Now think about this. Could that be something that that is realistic? Well, I think there's a. Is that something that could be realistic? I think it. Let me just switch to the microphone. That's something. Okay. No, it's fine. It's fine. I think. Good. So think about it. So creating an AI judge that's more interpretable than a human judge narrows the fairness gap. We said. Is this possible? And I would say it seems to me that that the human decision is the ultimate black box. So it's very difficult. I mean, sometimes we might think of a human decision to be very interpretable because humans are like us, and so we somehow feel that we are able to understand their decisions. But it's very difficult, for instance, to find out whether a human would have decided the case differently if the input factors would have been different. So it's very difficult to do this kind of counterfactual analysis with a human. Whereas with a machine, it's pretty easy to do it. You just kind of look at the output if you have one set of inputs, and at the output if you have another set of inputs. So in some way, I think it is possible, and kind of the extreme case would, of course, be a decision tree, where you are able to program the machine in a way that it follows the decision tree that was pre-programmed. So in some way, it is feasible to create machines that are more interpretable as human beings. And to the extent that this is possible, it's possible to narrow the fairness gap between humans and the machine. Second, a hearing in front of an AI judge could further narrow the fairness gap. And that's particularly relevant in those situations that you can think of where maybe a hearing in front of a human is just economically infeasible. If you look, for instance, at immigration procedures. Immigration procedures are I think, a good example where the immigrant usually only has a couple of, maybe a minute or so in front of the immigration judge. Or maybe not at all. So what you see there is that there is no meaningful hearing to begin with, and to the extent that you can overcome this resource constraint, the number of human judges, and assuming that they are pretty much fixed, then adding a machine that would kind of overcome this resource constraint would be a way to further narrow this gap between the machine and the human. And then we find that lay people don't consider an AI judge less fair if the AI judge's decision is interpretable, while the human judge's decision is not, what I told you is quite realistic, and if there's a hearing in front of the AI judge but not in front of the human judge. So if we have a situation where the AI judge, we have a hearing in front of the AI judge and it's interpretable, and a human where we have no hearing and it's not interpretable, then those two decision-making procedures are no different in our data. So that is kind of the extreme case where we can completely narrow the human AI fairness gap. And then we find that from the mediation analysis that the human AI advantage is more related to the decision's accuracy and comprehensiveness rather than to these distinctively human factors like understanding of the defendant's position and the feeling that the defendant had a voice. And this suggests that hard information about superior accuracy by algorithms in certain domains has the potential to further narrow the fairness gap. That's not what we did here. We didn't tell people the algorithm is more fair than the human, more accurate than the human, but you can certainly imagine domains. I'm not saying that this is across the board, but you could imagine domains where there is a ground truth. Let's, for instance, say some prediction of an empirical fact, some prediction of, a good example would be prediction of creditworthiness or something like that, where we have a ground truth. And there it might actually be possible to convince people by giving them hard evidence that the algorithm has certain advantages about the human, not just in the consistency of the decision, but also in the accuracy of the decision. And as we found out that humans care in their perceived fairness ratings about the perceived accuracy, being able to show them that in certain domains the algorithm is more accurate than the human has the potential to shift fairness ratings further. So we can imagine that we can sometimes even overcome and overcompensate this human AI fairness.
Just one question on this. What cases of damage compensation, like calculating damages, that would be a case where I would expect an algorithm to be performing way better than a human judge.
Yeah.
Would you consider that a case? Or
well,
I don't see a ground truth there, because it's not about truth, it's about calculating damage. So basically, you could have, for instance, in Italy it's a huge thing, in Europe in general it's a huge thing, non-pecuniary losses. And how do you calculate that's not a big thing in the US, but how you do that in Europe is you have a lot of information about how previous cases are decided, and you try to derive principles that then judges should apply in order to calculate with a certain kind of accuracy and consistency the amount of damages that should be compensated to a given judge, to a given claimant. So that would be a case where the ability of a system of processing huge amount of data and deriving information and criteria to calculate the amount that is due would actually largely surpass any human capacity. Typically, judges are not really mathematical minds, and that would be something that requires that kind of assessment.
Yeah, so I think this would be a case where I could imagine that you can produce some sort of objective information or data that suggests that the machine might be more accurate than the human decision maker. It would not really be a ground truth in the sense of the machine makes a prediction, the human make a prediction, and then we see what actually turns out, and the machine was more accurate in predicting what turned out to be the case. But you could imagine that maybe you can convince people of the superior accuracy of the machine by having a machine calculate the damages versus, let's say, having the machine calculate damages in cases that were already decided. And then you know what the judges actually did. You then have the machine do it, and then let's say you have a group of experts who take a sample out of the machine calculated damages and of the actual damages that judges calculated. And let's say those are experts in calculating damages, and they have no time constraints or are not important time constraints. And if we then find that this group of experts that has this time is more in line with what the machine does, or the machine predictions are more in line with what these experts would come up with than what the human judges did, then maybe that convinces people of the superior accuracy of the algorithm, and that would then, pursuant to our results, make them more likely to consider the algorithm as more fair on this ground than the human being. So I think it's a matter of degree what a ground truth is. So if we wanted to give guidance to people thinking about where to employ algorithms, or if we wanted to give guidance to people who construct these algorithms, what they should look for, one thing is, are you able to persuade people of the superior accuracy? And I think that your question, I think we can probably construct an answer to this question that would probably persuade most people. To the extent that we are able to, this helps in the acceptance of the algorithm. And by the way, it's good that we kind of transition in the discussion, because I only had these conclusions, and that would just kind of repeat what I already said. So, I mean, human judges are generally favored, but there are ways how we can compensate this gap. And I think we've shown you a couple of ways how this is possible. So I'm looking forward to your questions.